Hello everybody, my name is AIJ2009 and today we're going to be seeing what would happen if the Soviet Union returned in 2025. Now, the Soviet Union was a country that existed from 1924 to 1991 and consisted of Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. But now they're going to come back because of so the context of this video is that the Russian people are really annoyed about Vladimir Putin's incompetent handling at the war of Ukraine. They thought they would win in under a year, but Ukraine is holding out longer than they expected. And Ukraine would launch a counteroffensive into the Russian-occupied territories and into Russia themselves. This would cause a band of Soviets to launch up in Leningrad, wanting to bring back the Soviet Union because they thought they were actually competent. Thus, the Second Russian Civil War has begun between the neo-Bolsheviks and Putin's government. Poland would just annex Kaliningrad because Russia's in a civil war. And thus, the Russian Civil War has begun, with the Soviet capture of Moscow and execution of Vladimir Putin. The Russian government would launch a counteroffensive against the Soviets, but they would lose massive numbers of their men. And the Soviet manpower is growing significantly. They can afford to lose men. Putin's Russia couldn't. And Volgograd has been captured. Thus, Putin's Russia has decided to surrender to Ukraine, and in the peace negotiation, Ukraine would get some land in Russia, and Georgia would also get Sochi. Dang it. Now, Chechens will rise up in Russia, but the Soviets will easily take them over because they have the manpower. The Soviets will continue to push, and Volgograd will get renamed to Stalingrad, and St. Petersburg would get renamed to Leningrad. The Soviets would continue to attack into Russian territory in Siberia, eventually reaching Omsk, where the Battle of Omsk will begin. The Russians will fight fiercely, but the Soviets will win the Battle of Omsk. Or Omsk. How do you say it? Omsk or Omsk? Do you pronounce Omsk with an O or Omsk with an A? Anyway, enough rambling on about Omsk, and time for the Soviets to continue. Tanutuva will rise up as a socialist nation, aligned with the Soviets. And the Soviets will launch another uprising in Vladivostok. Japan will just take over Sakhalin and their islands. The Soviets will continue to push into Kamchatka as the Bolsheviks have practically won the Civil War. The Battle of Yakutsk will be the final nail in the coffin for Putin's Russia, where a large number of Russian soldiers get encircled by Soviet troops. And the Russians have surrendered to the Red Movement. And the person who wins the revolution would create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And the first thing they will do is they will try to get revenge on Ukraine with a surprise invasion into Donetsk. And yeah, this surprise invasion will take Kherson, and the Soviets will push into Sevastopol. They will also push in from the north in an attempt to reach Kiev. Poltava will also get taken. The Soviets will push into Odessa as Kiev falls and the Soviets win the war. And in the peace negotiations, Ukraine would become a Soviet republic as a puppet state. The Soviets would establish the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic as a puppet state, as the Soviets invade Belarus, and Minsk gets taken easily, and Belarus gets annexed into the Soviet Union. We're also ignoring NATO's existence, because, yeah. Oh wait, NATO does exist. But anyway, the Soviets will annex the Baltics, starting with Lithuania, and then annexing Latvia and Estonia. Now the Soviet Union will invade into Central Asia with a huge amount of men. 500 men. 5 million men. In fact, the Soviets will push from the north, and communist uprisings will happen in Kazakhstan, the Soviets will continue to push as the government of Kazakhstan surrenders. The Turkestan nations will also experience communist rebellion. There will be one in Kyrgyzstan that will take over the country. There will also be one in Turkmenistan, but that won't be so lucky, as they will be completely failed. But this causes the Soviet Union to invade into Turkmenistan from the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviets will also invade into Tajikistan, and they will establish a Tajik Soviet puppet. The Soviets will also push into Turkmenistan. And another communist revolution will happen in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. This revolution would happen in Bukhara. And this Turkmen revolution will happen in Turkmenbat. And this will be way better than before. The Tajiks will, or the Uzbeks will hold off the Uzbek Soviet Republic, but it won't be for long as they're annexed into the Soviets. The Soviets will also decide to create a Kyrgyzstan Soviet Republic, and thus the Soviets will annex Ukraine and the entirety of Central Asia. They will take over Moldova. Now it's time for them to demand the Caucasus. They are invading the Caucasus, and the Caucasus get annexed into the Soviets. China will invade Mongolia, and they will make them annex. The Soviets are worried about Vladivostok, so they're going to declare war on China. The Soviets will invade into Mongolia and Manchuria. They will also invade into East Turkestan. This is the first big Soviet war in a while. The Soviets will keep invading into Mongolia until they ultimately push the Chinese out of Mongolia. The Soviets will encircle a large amount of troops in Manchuria. As this encirclement gets squeezed in on. They will also make an encirclement in East Turkmenistan. In the end, after Beijing is fallen, China would surrender, and in the peace negotiation, Russia will get 3 new puppet states in Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Manchuria. Now the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan to get revenge for what they did in the 1980s. If you didn't know, the Afghans defeated the Soviets in the 1980s in a war called the Soviet-Afghan War. But the Soviets are not fighting the Mujahideen. Instead, they're fighting the Taliban. And the Taliban would dig in. And with the capture of Kabul, Afghanistan would surrender. And in the peace negotiations, Afghan would become a communist nation. Next up, the Soviets will invade Iran. Because they're already Eastern Aligned, but they wanted them to be more Soviet. So the Soviets would invade Iran from the north. With the new T-26, with the new T-28 tanks. The Soviets would breeze through Iran, and in the peace negotiations, the Soviets would annex northern Iran, and southern Iran would become the Iranian Socialist Republic. Now it's time for the big war now it's time for the Great Patriotic War against Europe. With the Soviet invasion of Poland. I feel like Poland has been pushed around a lot during their history, but their indomitable spirit has caused them to come back every single time. Historically, Poland was once a part of the Soviets, but in 1990, that Soviet control was shattered. The Soviets will also invade into Romania and Finland, starting the Winter War. They will also invade into Turkey. Warsaw would be encircled. And Poland would not surrender after the fall of Warsaw. Helsinki would also fall, but just like Poland, Finland would also not surrender after the loss of their capital city. It would take a full occupation to knock them down. After the capture of Gdansk, Poland has surrendered. This causes the Soviets to invade Czechia and Slovakia. And the Soviets would capture Prague, which, unlike Poland and Finland, would make Czechia surrender. And Bratislava would also be captured, making Slovakia surrender. The Soviets would also take over Austria. The stalemate in the Carpathian Mountains would be broken when the Soviets would take over Bucharest and make Romania surrender. At this point, Serbia goes under a socialist coup, causing them to invade Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia. At this point, Zagreb falls to the Serbian socialists. And the Hungarians know they are surrounded, and Budapest falls into the Soviets. The stalemate in Turkey would be broken by the Soviet new T-34s, or T-30s, main battle tanks, as the Soviets would invade into Bulgaria, capturing Sofia and making Bulgaria surrender. They would be given to Serbia in the peace negotiations. Albania will also be occupied by the Soviets. After Thessaloniki gets taken, Greece would undergo a communist rebellion. In Athens, the Greeks became communist, and the Serbs would annex Bulgaria. So, after the taking of Istanbul, the Soviets connect their two fronts, the Anatolia front and the Balkan front. Kurdistan would also launch a rebellion. And, yeah. The Turks, after the fall of Ankara, would have fallen to the Soviets. Now there is still one more enemy to take care of, Germany, as the Soviets focus all their forces on taking over Berlin. Now the Soviets would invade into Japan. As Soviet North Korea would invade into South Korea. Uniting Korea under Democratic People's Republic of Korea that would invade into Japan. Japan would surrender. as the Soviets would take over most of Germany and Austria. The Red Flood would have taken over completely Germany and would invade into Italy. Invading from Venice. The Red Flood would also invade into Sweden and Norway. With the capture of Stockholm, Sweden would surrender to the communists. And Oslo would get encircled, making Norway surrender. Now, the Soviets knew they would have to invade Alaska. So they decided to invade it now. And they would take over Anchorage. And then the Great War from Fallout starts. No, I'm kidding. Although this would be horrible. The Soviets would push into Milan and Genoa. They would also take over Rome. At this point, the Italian communists started in Sicily and Naples. And they would defeat Italy. And thus, the West knows they can't compete with the Red Flood, so they surrender. And in the peace negotiations, Germany would become a communist nation and get some land. Italy would also become communist and get some land. Serbia would become a socialist republic. Poland would just be completely gone. Bohemia and Moravia would become communist. Slovakia will become communist. Albania will become communist. Greece will become communist. Turkey will become communist. Denmark will become communist. Sweden will become communist. And Norway will become communist. And all these communist nations would become puppets to the Soviets. And they would establish the Moscow Pact. And also the Soviets would annex Alaska. And the new Cold War would start. Between the Moscow Pact and NATO. Turkey would also lose a ton of land, including some land in around the Bosphorus Strait and Anatolia. Okay, guys, that's going to end this video. Please like, subscribe, and hit that bell to turn notifications. I'll see you in the next one, and next up, we're probably going to do What If Italy Reformed the Roman Empire in 2025. Ideologies 2009, out. Bye!